Just 48 hours ago, the world woke up to breaking news that seemed ripped from a Hollywood thriller. US military helicopters descended on Venezuela's capital. The president of a sovereign nation was seized from his own palace and flown to New York to face trial. But here's what they're not telling you. This wasn't the beginning. This was the climax of a story that's been unfolding for over a century. A story of black gold, broken promises, and a battle that started the moment someone struck oil in the Venezuelan soil back in 1914. What if I told you that everything happening right now was set in motion 112 years ago? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why this conflict could reshape the entire Western Hemisphere, and why your country might be next. Welcome to Salvoscope, where we don't just report the news, we decode the patterns behind it. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into one of the most explosive geopolitical conflicts of our time. If you value real, unfiltered analysis of world events, hit that subscribe button right now. We're one of the few channels brave enough to connect the dots others won't touch. New videos every week breaking down the stories that shape our world. Now, let's go back to where it all started. Not 2026, not 1999, but 1914, when American companies first drilled into Venezuela's earth and changed history forever. April 15th, 1914. A date most history books ignore. While Europe was just months away from World War I, something equally significant was happening in Venezuela's Maracaibo Basin. An American geologist named Ralph Arnold, interestingly, working under future US President Herbert Hoover, had just discovered what would become one of the world's largest oil deposits. The well was called Zumaki-E, and it changed everything. Here's the staggering part. Within just 14 years, by 1928, Venezuela went from virtually zero oil production to becoming the world's leading oil exporter. American companies like Standard Oil, today's ExxonMobil, and Gulf Oil were at the center of this transformation. But there was a dark side to this prosperity. The dictator's deal. To secure these lucrative oil concessions, the United States backed one of the most brutal dictators in Latin American history, Juan Vicente Gómez, known as the Catfish. Listen to this carefully, because this pattern repeats throughout our story. Gómez ruled Venezuela from 1908 to 1935 with medieval brutality. Political prisoners were shackled in leg irons that left them permanently disabled, if they were lucky. The unlucky ones, they were hanged by meat hooks through their throats or testicles. Gómez accumulated a personal fortune worth over $3.6 billion in today's money. Meanwhile, his people suffered in poverty. But here's the crucial part. The United States didn't care about any of this. Why? Because Gómez granted highly lucrative concessions to American oil companies. By 1930, Venezuela was producing 141 million barrels per year. The American companies, Shell, Gulf Oil, and Exxon, controlled 99% of total oil production. Venezuela had become America's gas station, and Washington would do anything to keep it that way. The post-war partnership. During World War II, Venezuela became critical to the Allied war effort, supplying massive amounts of oil. The relationship between the US and Venezuela seemed unbreakable, but then came 1943, and this is where the cracks started showing. President Isaías Medina Angarita passed the Hydrocarbon Law of 1943, demanding that oil companies pay 16.67% royalties. By 1948, amendments required oil companies to give 50% of their profits to the Venezuelan state. The writing was on the wall. Venezuelans were starting to ask, why are foreign companies getting rich from our oil while our people stay poor? But the United States had another ace up its sleeve, another brutal dictator named Marcos Pérez Jiménez, who ruled from 1948 to 1958. Same playbook, same brutality. Political prisoners were tortured in ways that would make your stomach turn. But Pérez Jiménez was generous to transnational corporations. So the United States awarded him the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct. Let that sink in. A dictator who tortured his own people received America's fourth highest military honor. Notice the pattern yet? As long as American oil companies could operate freely, Washington didn't care who ruled Venezuela or how they ruled. But this arrangement was about to face its greatest challenge. 1958. The Venezuelan people had finally had enough. Pérez Jiménez was overthrown, and something remarkable happened. Venezuela transitioned to democracy. Enter Rómulo Betancourt, considered the founding father of modern democratic Venezuela. He served as president during this democratic transition and became a fascinating figure in this story. Here's what makes this period so interesting. The US and Venezuela maintained strong relations, but not because of shared democratic values. Let me explain. The Cold War calculus. During the Cold War, the United States needed stable, anti-communist allies in Latin America. Venezuela fit the bill perfectly. Despite sometimes disagreeing with US policies, Venezuela remained staunchly anti-communist and kept the oil flowing. Throughout the 1960s, 1990s, the United States was by far Venezuela's largest trade partner. American companies continued to be the largest foreign investors, not just in oil, but in mining and other sectors. But here's the game changer nobody saw coming: the 1973 oil crisis and nationalization. In 1973, Arab OPEC countries cut off oil supplies to the West during the Arab-Israeli conflict. Global oil prices skyrocketed. But here's what's remarkable. Venezuela, led by Carlos Andrés Pérez, refused to join the embargo. Venezuela kept pumping oil to the United States and Europe, reinforcing its image as a reliable supplier. The United States was grateful, or so it seemed. Because just 3 years later, in 1976, Carlos Andrés Pérez did something that would change everything. On January 1st, 1976, at the Mene Grande oil field, remember the same field discovered in 1914, President Pérez announced the nationalization of Venezuela's oil industry. B-roll, nationalization ceremony. PDVSA founding. Petróleos de Venezuela, or PDVSA, was born. Venezuela's oil now belonged to Venezuelans. Now here's what's crucial to understand, and what current US officials conveniently forget when they talk about Venezuela stealing American assets. This nationalization was nothing like what happened in Iran or Mexico. American companies were fully compensated, about $1 billion. They were even invited to continue working as service providers and technology partners. There was no diplomatic crisis, no confrontation. So when you hear politicians today talking about Venezuela's tyrannical expropriation and theft of American wealth, remember this. The 1976 nationalization was peaceful, legal, and compensated. What they're really angry about is that Venezuela took control of its own resources. The illusion of partnership continues. For the next 2 decades, relations remained relatively stable. PDVSA was professionally managed, largely by Western-educated technocrats. Venezuela continued to be a major oil supplier to the United States, exporting 1.5 to 2 million barrels per day. But beneath this surface stability, something was brewing. Venezuela had become what economists call a petrostate, dangerously dependent on oil revenues. And as always happens with petrostates, corruption flourished. By the late 1990s, despite massive oil wealth, 80% of Venezuela's population lived in poverty. Only 20% benefited from the nation's oil riches. The political establishment had grown corrupt and complacent. The stage was set for a revolutionary change. And in 1998, it arrived in the form of a charismatic former military officer with a vision to redistribute Venezuela's oil wealth. His name was Hugo Chavez. And that's when America's patience ran out. December 1998. Hugo Chavez won the Venezuelan presidency in a landslide, the first leader to celebrate his African and indigenous heritage. A man who promised to combat poverty and redistribute oil wealth from the elite minority to the poor majority. And here's what makes this moment so critical. Before Chavez even took office in 1999, capital flight from Venezuela accelerated. The Venezuelan oligarchy started moving their wealth to Miami. They knew what was coming. In 2001, Chavez enacted a new hydrocarbons law that brought the state back into full control of the oil industry. Foreign oil companies would have to accept minority stakes in joint ventures with PDVSA. This deeply angered ExxonMobil and Chevron, who put pressure on the Bush administration to act. And act they did. Starting in 2001, the United States began funding anti-Chavez groups through the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID, totaling about $3.3 million, according to the State Department's own internal investigation, April 11, 2002. Opposition groups organized massive demonstrations. Violence erupted. By April 12th, the military had arrested Chavez and flown him to a remote island. Pedro Carmona, a business leader, declared himself president and immediately dissolved the National Assembly, the Supreme Court, and the Constitution. The United States government, through spokesman Ari Fleischer, claimed Chavez had resigned and that the new transitional civilian government deserved support. But here's what we now know from declassified CIA documents. The CIA had detailed advance knowledge of the coup plans. They knew the plotters were planning to arrest the president. They knew violence might be provoked to justify military action. Yet they said nothing to warn the Venezuelan government. But something unexpected happened. Millions of Venezuelans poured into the streets demanding Chavez's return. Loyal military units refused to support the coup. Within 48 hours, Chavez was back in power. The coup had failed. But the war on Venezuela had just begun. When the coup failed, opponents tried a different tactic. In December 2002, oil company managers, with US backing, launched a strike designed to cripple Venezuela's economy. For 2 months, oil production ground to a halt. The economy suffered massive damage. But Chavez's government, supported by oil workers, not managers, eventually broke the strike. Chavez fired 18,000 PDVSA employees who participated in the strike and rebuilt the company from scratch. Now, here's what really terrified Washington. Chavez wasn't just talking about redistributing oil wealth, he was actually doing it. Through programs called missions, his government dramatically reduced poverty and illiteracy. Healthcare and education became accessible to millions who'd been excluded for generations. In 2004, when opponents tried to recall him through a referendum, he won with 59% of the vote. But Chavez went further. He began exporting his Bolivarian revolution, forging closer ties with Cuba, Russia, Iran, and China. He even provided free heating oil to poor Americans through a program run by former US Congressman Joseph Kennedy. In 2006, at the United Nations, Chavez famously called President George W. Bush the devil and said the podium still smells of sulfur. The United States began a systematic campaign to isolate Venezuela. 2005, first sanctions imposed after oil asset nationalizations. 2006, arms embargo imposed. 2006, credit rating agencies began making it harder for Venezuela to borrow money. Continued funding of opposition groups, diplomatic pressure to isolate Venezuela internationally. And then, in March 2013, Hugo Chavez died of cancer. His vice president and chosen successor, Nicolás Maduro, assumed power. What happened next would take the conflict to unprecedented levels. When Nicolás Maduro took office in 2013, he inherited 3 massive problems. First, he lacked Chavez's charisma and political skill. Second, oil prices were about to collapse. Third, the United States was about to unleash a pressure campaign unlike anything seen before. In June 2014, oil prices peaked at $108 per barrel. By January 2016, they had crashed below 30. For Venezuela, which had become dangerously dependent on oil revenues, this was catastrophic. Years of underinvestment, mismanagement, and corruption in PDVSA meant Venezuela couldn't adjust. Oil production collapsed. Hyperinflation set in. Food and medicine became scarce. Now critics will say this proves socialism failed. Supporters say it proves economic warfare worked. The truth, both factors played a role. But what's undeniable is what happened next. 2015. President Obama declares Venezuela an extraordinary threat to national security, the legal basis for sanctions. 2017. Trump administration begins comprehensive sanctions targeting Venezuela's financial sector. 2018. Sanctions on oil imports intensify. 2019, oil imports from Venezuela banned entirely. 2019. The United States recognizes Juan Guaidó, not Maduro, as Venezuela's legitimate president. 2019-2024. Assets frozen. International isolation intensifies. The results were devastating. Oil production, which had been over 3 million barrels per day in 2000, collapsed to under 500,000 barrels per day by 2020. Over 7 million Venezuelans, nearly a quarter of the population, fled the country. In July 2024, Maduro claimed victory in presidential elections. The opposition also claimed victory, citing independent vote tallies. The United States and many other countries refused to recognize the results. The stage was set for the final confrontation. Enter Donald Trump, returning to the presidency in January 2025. January 2025. Trump's second term began with an immediate reversal of his predecessor's policies. He revoked temporary protected status for 600,000 Venezuelans in the US and signaled a hard line. February 2025. Tren de Aragua gang designated as foreign terrorist organization. September 2025. US begins airstrikes on boats allegedly trafficking drugs from Venezuela. At least 90 people killed. November 2025. Largest US military buildup in the Caribbean in decades. December 2025. Trump imposes total and complete blockade of oil tankers. December 2025. CIA authorized to conduct covert operations in Venezuela. January 2nd, 2026. US designates the Cartel of the Suns, allegedly led by Maduro, as a terrorist organization. Notice the pattern. First, you designate the target as terrorists. Then, you claim you're conducting counter-terrorism operations, not regime change. At 2:00 a.m. local time, over 150 US military aircraft took off. MH-47 Chinook helicopters descended on Caracas. Codename, Operation Absolute Resolve. Within hours, President Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, were captured and flown to the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier, then to New York. According to Venezuelan and Cuban officials, over 80 people were killed in the operation, including 32 Cuban military and intelligence personnel. In Vice President Delcy Rodriguez became acting president. Attorney General Pam Bondi announced Maduro faces narco-terrorism charges in Manhattan federal court. At a news conference, Trump made his intentions crystal clear. "We're going to run the country," he said. "We're going to have our very large US oil companies go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, and start making money. The revenue will be used to support Venezuela and also reimburse the United States." There it is. After 112 years, we've come full circle. American companies drilling Venezuela's oil. But this time, they're not paying a dictator for concessions. They're operating under US military occupation.